Welcome to Adventures in Relationship, a psychoeducational show about healthy relationships for adults with complex trauma, where we recognize that relational recovery is an adventure. I'm Amy Gordon. I am an individual and couples psychotherapist working on unceded Tiwa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also offer virtual therapy, so reach out if you'd like to work with me individually or as a couple. Just as relational recovery is an adventure, each unique relationship is its own adventure as well. And almost everyone I work with, at least almost every individual I work with, eventually asks something along the lines of, why does this keep happening to me? Why do my romantic relationships all start out feeling really different, but somehow end up feeling exactly the same? And, if this sounds familiar to you, this is definitely the episode to listen to. Maybe you're finally ready to date again, maybe after a divorce or after surviving another relationship that slowly wore you down. You might have left behind some unhealthy dynamics and promised yourself that next time would be different. You might have even updated your vows to yourself, so to speak. You committed to better boundaries, better communication, and a better choice of partner. You might have even changed cities, changed friend groups, and really changed your life to a large extent. And then you meet somebody new, and at first, it really is different. They're not your ex, they don't look or act like your ex, but there might be a few yellow flags or orange ones that you kind of, nobody's perfect. And so, that's maybe okay at first. And, nothing like unmistakably red, at least. Those red flags, that's maybe for a little bit of a different conversation if you're dismissing red flags. But these ones that are like, this person's clearly not completely healed, but who is? But you're excited, you're proud. It's a new relationship that feels good. And then months pass, and one day you look around and realize you've arrived somewhere familiar. Like the arguments aren't identical, but your heart feels the same. Or you start feeling things that you did before, like fearful anticipation, hypervigilant scanning, or powerless frustration. Whatever that kind of underlying discontent feeling is coming up again. And you recognize the emotional landscape before you consciously understand why. And this is the moment when people tend to ask, is my picker broken? Is something deeper happening? In the introduction to this show, I describe relational recovery as an adventure. And in much the same way, each unique relationship is its own adventure, like I said. So, in kind of elaborating on that, I'll say every partnership has different terrain, different threats, different emotional weather systems. But many of us keep finding ourselves kind of hiking, I guess you could say hiking versions of the same trail. And when that happens, we tend to interpret it as failure or we judge ourselves. That judgment or our low self esteem and the like. But shame is a lie. That self judgment, that self condemnation, it's a lie and it's a symptom of complex trauma. What I'm here to say is that thinking of yourself as having a broken picker might not be the most helpful way to implement change in your life. I want to offer you a different frame. Ending up in familiar relational dynamics usually means your navigation tools were calibrated in childhood and never sufficiently updated. Most of us learned intimacy from emotionally immature caregivers. Those early experiences quietly become our internal maps and compasses, and unless we intentionally revise them, we continue navigating adult love using childhood survival equipment. So the issue isn't that your broker is the issue is not that your picker is broken, but your navigational tools are outdated. It's that your inner compass learned the wrong version of true north. If closeness once included neglect, criticism, unpredictability, or emotional absence, then familiarity itself can pull you towards partners who recreate those conditions. I hear clients say this a lot. The nice ones all just seem so boring. And I understand that sentiment deeply. Nobody wants a relationship that feels flat or lifeless. But many trauma survivors have only experienced relationships that were extreme, either emotionally dead or completely chaotic and exhausting. But it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to choose between passion or stability. Complex trauma trains the mind toward extremes like exciting or dull, safe and suffocating. But there are many emotionally available people who live in the middle ground where attraction grows and intimacy isn't fueled by anxiety. Right now, culturally, there's a lot of focus on this idea of the broken picker. You hear it on podcasts and therapy language online, discourse around attachment. People asking, why they keep choosing avoidant partners, emotionally unavailable partners, or relationships that just always become painful. But here's where my perspective differs. I don't actually think people are consciously choosing partners who are a bad match for them. Let me explain. Attachment trauma interferes with our ability to distinguish the emotional dynamics of childhood from those of adult partnerships. I'll say that one more time. Attachment trauma interferes with our ability to distinguish the emotional dynamics of childhood from those of adult partnerships. Over a century ago, Sigmund Freud, please don't turn off the podcast just yet. Stay with me for a minute. Sigmund Freud described something he called repetition compulsion. He's the one who's credited with kind of the original term repetition compulsion that we use. A lot of modern clinicians call it reenactment. But anyway, he was credited, so whatever. I'll just mention that Sigmund Freud is the one who came up with that term, allegedly at least. But he really fucked up his interpretation as to why this happened. He had some bizarro reasons that people do this that are inaccurate. I'm not even going to go into that. But he noticed something important, that people repeatedly recreate painful dynamics they claim to want to avoid. Like I said, modern clinicians call this reenactment, and when it comes to relationships, we call this relational reenactment. So relational reenactment makes sense when you understand its purpose. It's an unconscious attempt to resolve something that's essentially unfinished. So to gain agency or power where you had none in the dynamic previously, and maybe to finally succeed in a situation that once left you confused, overwhelmed, and I think powerless is another appropriate word. It's a really deeply human thing to do, like restarting a difficult level in a video game after you die or game over, right? You're hoping that this time you'll beat the boss and finally get to move on to the next level. If you grew up feeling unchosen, your adult relationships might recurrently feel like a struggle for loyalty. And when you have the experience of that relationship kind of floundering, there's an instinct to want to try again. So if attention was scarce, you may feel drawn toward partners whose availability you feel you have to earn. If criticism shaped your childhood, you might be especially activated, really, by perceived judgment. And each adult conflict begins carrying echoes of something older. And here's what's so hard about it. Reenactment requires the presence of the original frustration. So this is a frustration we've been carrying lifelong. We don't usually experience the absence of old wounds as potential for chemistry, though. For adults with complex trauma, some element of the dynamic between you and the other has to feel activating for attraction to register. This means that attraction itself can become trauma-driven. And without recognizing this, people either believe they make bad choices or they simply have bad luck. But many trauma survivors aren't drawn randomly. They're drawn toward recognition of of that feeling. When they say it feels like home, I'll get to that. But they're drawn toward recognition. If the version of love from your childhood required walking on eggshells, earning warmth, or monitoring the other's emotions, then unpredictability can register as intimacy. It feels like home, like I said, and that's not always a good thing. And this explains the flip side of the picker question. Why do healthy people sometimes feel unappealing? If you meet someone steady who communicates clearly and consistently, they show their interest in you consistently, instead of relief, you might feel flat, turned off, irritated, and I've even heard suspicious. And I think that suspiciousness comes from trauma. Calm can feel uneasy when connection was historically paired with hypervigilance. So without volatility, there's nothing to track. Stability can register as a lack of chemistry because your system is sort of fishing for something to focus on. And, at the same time, inconsistency activates you. And activation feels exciting, it might feel meaningful, but oftentimes it does feel like chemistry. And it's not that you want suffering. You're clearly not choosing suffering because suffering is familiar to your nervous system, though. It tends to be what we're drawn to, but this is an entirely unconscious process. It's not about a choice that you're making. So, how do you begin changing this pattern? First, I want to suggest that you find a way to interrupt shame spiraling around your so-called picker. Try to remind yourself that you're not failing, that you're, very intelligent. Human nervous system is drawing you toward dynamics that you recognize. And simple awareness can sometimes interrupt the compulsion to reenact. And the more you practice self-awareness, the more you practice awareness as you're kind of exploring your attraction to somebody, the easier it becomes. Compulsivity is an unconscious process. It requires invisibility. So keep on with becoming increasingly aware of what's happening in your head, in your heart, and in your body. It does take time, but this is a massively important process of relational recovery with yourself, with others, and with your mental health. So it's important. And the same principle of awareness applies if you notice yourself thinking, I really like them, but something feels off. I feel anxious, or even, they're great, but I feel bored with them. Either way, try pausing long enough to ask, when have I felt this before? Often the answer predates adulthood, sometimes identifying the dynamics from our childhood that are leading us to feel connected to people who remind us of our childhood can be really, really helpful. Another thing you can try, which never really worked for me, honestly, but I think that it is a good recommendation. It's to learn to tolerate unfamiliar safety. Some relationships begin without fireworks, where interest grows with predictability and emotional consistency. This can feel painstakingly slow, but it might be worth the effort. I've seen a number of healthy relationships that started with one person feeling suspicious of how their partner seemed to be, and eventually started to feel comfortable and even excited to be in such a relationship. For me, the reason why I say this hasn't really worked is because I tried this approach and I ended up spending 10 years with someone who really didn't float my boat, so to speak. And the relationship had to end after years of my trying. But my life isn't yours, and sometimes this really does work. Another thing I can offer is that you can expect and allow for any and all grief that will inevitably arise in your process of relational change. So just notice that grief and allow it to exist. Remind yourself that it's a temporary experience, and Share with and lean on trustworthy and supportive others. When you live a life that feels kind of isolated, journaling and connecting with nature and with animals can also be helpful. You can attend online 12-step meetings for a sense of connection with other people, but just allow your body to release that stored up emotion, that pent up emotion that exists in your system. And this can look different to different people. Sometimes it's shaking and sobbing, but let your body guide movement. Grief might be expressed through crying or gasping, even dancing, letting somebody hold and hug you if that's available. Some other alternatives to being held or hugged by others are to wrap yourself in a thick blanket or to place your hand on your heart like this, or giving yourself a nice, tight self hug. The point of that kind of self touch is really to offer yourself love and connection and to connect with all that's lovable in the world, really. Changing relational reenactment patterns often requires relinquishing fantasies about who and how another person can finally repair what your previous relationships damaged. Not that healing doesn't occur in safe relationships, it does. But accepting the reality of relational healing, looking and feeling different than what you expected, is going to bring up some grief for you. Longing for healing love is so real and understandable, but healing rarely arrives through recreating the past. It mostly arrives through building something new enough for long enough that neuroplasticity can implement the changes that actually result in life feeling different and better and safer. And I can attest to the reality of this possibility. If you take anything away from this episode, I hope it'll be a knowing that relational reenactment is not evidence that you're doomed or that you're making bad choices. It just means that you're trying to learn and trying to solve past predicaments. Your intention is to move toward connection, and that's a really good thing. It's just that your movement is guided by kind of that old gear, those old maps and old compasses. So don't blame yourself for where you are. Just honor the reality of wanting to, maybe needing to, but at least wanting to update your navigation system so that familiarity stops being your only true north. Let ever increasing awareness lead to conscious choice and begin to guide your relational expedition, for you to be the guide. You're not alone in this terrain, and you're not starting from scratch. You're learning how to recognize the trail while you're still hiking it. And that's absolutely where change begins. Thank you for being here. Thank yourself for bringing you here. You are on your way. And as always, I want to encourage you to get professional help locally or online if you're struggling. I am a therapist, but I'm likely not your therapist, and I can't ethically make any observation or recommendation without consensually entering a provider relationship with you. If you want to work with me, please just reach out through any available means. Also, I haven't said this in a while, so I just want to say hello to the few clients of mine who do listen to this podcast. Hi. And I'll add my usual disclaimer: don't rely on podcasts or webcasts as your primary mental health support. Take good care of yourself and your partner if you're committed. You don't have to abandon yourself to do so. Keep listening to my podcast or watching this YouTube channel to continue to learn how to do that, how to take good care of yourself and your partner at the same time without abandoning yourself. Once again, I just really appreciate you taking the time to watch or listen to this. And my mission is to help adults with complex trauma find emotional freedom and learn how to thrive in relationships. So if you can take a moment to follow, rate, review, or share this episode, it's really helpful. I put a lot of unpaid time and effort into this, so any reciprocation is much appreciated. Thank you once again for watching or listening. Till next time.